Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar on key changes in the FEMA regulations. So we will today be covering about 4 key changes that have happened. The last year has been very interesting as far as changes to the FEMA are concerned. There has been a concerted effort by the regulators to both simplify procedural aspects of FEMA as well as liberalize various aspects of what is it that Indian companies can do when dealing with foreign exchange. So today we will cover one key procedural change, which has been the overhaul of the reporting regime. So we will talk about the new reporting regime under FEMA. That's an important procedural change. We will also try to cover 2 very important substantive changes. One relates to the changes in the external debt-related framework, and the second one deals with something which hits a little closer home, which is changes to the e-commerce regime as well. We'll also touch a little bit more to conclude on procedural aspects relating to the way in which cross-border mergers can happen. And we have a team of lawyers from Samvad who will be covering these topics. And my colleague Vishnu will now talk about procedural changes in reporting. Over to you, Vishnu.
Thanks, Neela. As she mentioned, we'll first start off, with some important procedural changes. And again, the idea here has been to sort of simplify FDI reporting. And also just to add some context to the structure of how this will work, we'll just cover these topics first, and then we also have a short Q&A session after. So to begin with, we need to understand, what the reporting scenario was before these changes were introduced. For example, if you were doing a foreign direct investment, you had a couple of forms that needed to be filed with the RBI. You had something called a ARF, and then you had another form called an FCGPR. So both of these documents, it basically related to the same investment, but one dealt with sort of the instruments being issued, and the other one dealt with the money coming in. And there was a lot of the filing of one document, the ARF. You would need that number in order to file the second document, and there were a lot of delays in sort of making one filing which affected the other. There were a lot of players involved in this process, including AD banks. And so what happened in a lot of cases, sometimes when the company also was not at fault, it would result in a delayed reporting. And that always became a major pain point. Even having a small reporting non-compliance under FEMA was a cause of significant stress for these companies. So I think to reduce that complexity and do away with scope for such errors and interplay between a lot of players, the new system makes a lot of sense. So first, what they've done is they've introduced a new portal called Firms, through which you have to make all of these filings, and this replaces the eBiz portal. So now through Firms, any company which is receiving FDI for the first time needs to fill in an entity master form. And now when you fill in that entity master form, you provide basic details of the investments you've already received in the past, and also brief details of the company's existing particulars. So again, this really simplifies the process, because subsequently when you are making your filings under the SMF, what happens is a lot of those fields are auto-populated based on the information you have submitted under the entity master form. So that again simplifies life. Even if it's as simple as so you're not having to make routine data entry, that makes the submission of these forms a lot faster. Then coming to the SMF form, so that form sort of subsumes a lot of forms within its ambit. One being the FCGPR, FCTRS, Form LLP1, Form LLP2, Form ESOP, Form CN, Form DRR, Form DI, and Form INVI. So it again made the whole process a lot simpler for companies. Instead of having to file 9 different forms, you have one form that you could file. Now, so again, in this form, when you fill in the details of the investment, and they have entries for sort of entering the number of equity shares, the number of preference shares, and what one really good feature over here is that once you make all of this data entry, it auto populates the sort of revised cap table of the company, which again simplifies things. Now over here, another important change, with this whole new system, is that for these sort of filings, you get a acknowledgement from the AD bank. It's no longer an acknowledgement from the RBI in the case of this filing. And the AD bank also has a strict timeline within which they sort of have to approve the form or raise any issues. Now, the reason this is relevant is because under the old regime, you would often see that you would not actually get your FCGPR allotment number for a significant time after the investment has concluded. We've seen cases where up to 6 months to a year the FCGPR acknowledgement has not come, and that was always a bit of a pain and stress point for both the foreign investors as well as the company. So now over here, when you have a guarantee, and we've seen the acknowledgements coming in a lot faster, it's actually quite unprecedented, and it's a really good change to the way reporting is being done. And another reason why this whole sort of requiring the AD bank to get back within the strict timeline is really important is because we've seen that sometimes with certain AD banks in the past, there have been issues where they have their own sort of unique requirements with respect to how an FIRC should be, and that has sort of led to delays. And we've seen companies and investors holding their hands up saying, I submitted the form in time. The AD bank has sort of delayed processing that, or there have been sort of unreasonable demands and requests, which is why the timelines for submission have sort of not been met. And the company has the burden of sort of explaining to the RBI why there was a delay and things like that. So I think a lot of those pain points are now gone in this new system, and it's a welcome change. And so based on our experience so far, I mean, it seems to be relatively trouble-free. So I think that's all we wanted to say on the SMF and the reporting changes as of now. I'll hand it over to Neela again, who will be introducing the next speaker.
Thanks, Vishnu. I think that was a very succinct summary of what we've been seeing as far as the procedural changes have been working. And the other, just wanted to point out a couple of things. So there have also been certain issues with the way in which this platform has been working. I think one of the biggest pain points is the fact that multiple filings cannot be processed at the same time. So for example, if you were doing a transaction where you had multiple share purchases all going through at the same time, you can only upload a form relating to a certain purchase at one time, and once that has been approved, then you can start with the next one, right? So I think this experience has been a little cumbersome in terms of getting things done a little quickly. So practically speaking, the way in which deals close, I think has undergone a little bit of change, because historically, in terms of closing of deals, there would be a concern from the acquirer or the buyer side that all the forms processing is done, acknowledgements taken on record, resolutions passed, entries in registers made, etc., all on the same day. But with this new system, as deal lawyers, we'll all have to adapt also to these new changes. There are also some other issues with how to fill these forms, I think, and the RBI has also designated certain officers to answer queries. So companies which are facing any problems with dealing with these forms can also approach the RBI and these designated officers to get clarification. To my mind, I think one of the best aspects of the new procedural regime is the fact, as Vishnu was mentioning, that there are timelines imposed on the authorized dealer within which these forms must be taken on record. So this really simplifies matters, because one of the most common problems we see, again, as deal lawyers, is that forms like FCGPR, which has now been integrated into the SMF, acknowledgements would be pending for months. The company would not have kept any copies of the filing. There is no clarity whether the forms were ever filed at all. And even if they were filed, they would not have followed up on acknowledgements. So these are all very common diligence issues that as deal lawyers were used to seeing. So it remains to be seen whether some of those pain points would get sorted out now that everything has moved to a kind of computerized system. So, so thanks, Vishnu. That was an interesting overview on the procedural regime. So we're next going to come to a very interesting topic, that of the recent liberalization in the regime relating to external commercial borrowing. So prior to these changes, which came in very recently, hardly a few weeks ago, the regime on who could borrow and who could lend in foreign exchange was quite restricted. The regulator has now tried to liberalize this framework to make it easier for companies which are otherwise eligible to receive FDI to also borrow in foreign exchange. So handing the floor over now to my colleague Samyukta, who will give an overview on each of these. Samyukta.
Good afternoon, everyone. Like Neela said, the ECB policy that has been introduced on January 16th of this year is a fairly liberalized regime as compared to the one that existed under the master direction, which was notified on January 1st of 2016. Just to give you a bit of background, as a precursor to this new ECB policy framework, the RBI had in December of last year issued a circular which basically consolidated the borrowing and lending regulations in foreign currency and in Indian rupees into one single bucket. And these regulations also had an enabling clause allowing borrowing under the ECB route. So Schedule 1 of these regulations gave a very brief overview of how the ECB regime would look going forward. Now, with the coming of this ECB policy, essentially, like Neela said, what has happened is that there has been a considerable liberalization on who are the recognized borrowers and lenders. I'll be going step by step on the major highlights under this new ECB framework. Okay, so to give you a little bit of background, under the ECB master direction, we had 4 separate categories of who were 4 tracks of ECB. So track 1 and track 2 essentially dealt with foreign currency ECBs. Track 1 was basically medium-term foreign currency ECBs, which meant that the ECBs had a minimum average maturity period of about 3 to 5 years. And track 2 was long term, which had a minimum average maturity period of 10 years. Track 3 was basically Indian currency ECBs, and there was a separate section dealing with rupee denominated bonds from overseas, which are popularly known as masala bonds. Now, what the current ECB framework has done is to just consolidate them into 2 tracks, where there are 2 major umbrellas. One are the INR ECBs and one are the foreign currency ECBs. The second major highlight of this framework is the scope of eligible borrowers has been relaxed considerably. So now any resident entity which is eligible to receive FDI would be deemed an eligible borrower. And it also includes other entities like port trusts, units in special economic zones, Exim Bank, entities engaged in the microfinance activities, etc. The third major highlight is actually something that used to concern resident borrowers a lot earlier, which was basically that an ECB lender had to be a foreign equity holder. Now, the way that term was defined under the earlier regulations was that the foreign lender had to either have a direct holding in the resident entity up to 25% or an indirect holding up to 51%. Now, this has been done away with, and only if the lender is an individual does he have to be a foreign equity holder to be eligible as a recognized lender under these regulations. Moving on to the next highlight, which is basically that the average maturity period for an ECB has now uniformly been standardized across all tracks, all ECBs, to 3 years, which was not the case under the earlier regulations. It varied, like I said, for a foreign currency ECB, which was of medium term, it was about 3 to 5 years. If it was long term, it was 10 years, etc. So it varied across the different tracks. The next is on end-use prescriptions, which was basically to say what are the ECB proceeds allowed to be utilized for. Again, these have been considerably standardized. Earlier, there were specific restrictions imposed on each of the type of or tracks of ECBs that were allowed. Right now, they are standardized across all tracks, and the only restrictions that they have really are that they cannot be used for real estate activities and for working capital or general corporate purposes, unless again it's being lent by a foreign equity holder. There's one thing that I'd like to highlight on the startup ECB regime, although we're not going into that particularly in this presentation, is that the advantage a startup ECB really has is that the language in the framework, earlier framework and this framework, is so broad that basically the ECB proceeds can be used for any purpose as long as it's in connection with the business of the company. So that does give them a fair amount of flexibility as to what they're using and going to utilize the ECB for. Lastly, the individual limits on borrowing under the ECB route have again been standardized and fixed at $750 million for all kinds of ECBs, which was not the case earlier. And only if it is raised from a direct foreign equity holder is it subject to a liability equity ratio. In the next slide, we've just highlighted a couple of other changes that have come about under the ECB framework. One is basically consolidation of Form ECB, which was earlier for application of an ECB and registration of the loan. And 2 is Form 83 for reporting. So now they all come under the same umbrella form of Form ECB. There is also a late submission fee which has been introduced. So any delay in reporting would be subject to a late submission fee. A newly introduced concept is that of a standard operating procedure that has to be followed by AD banks for untraceable entities, which are basically entities which have either, not filed their reports for a couple of quarters, or they haven't been responsive when the AD banks have tried to contact them, or they have not been available at their registered office when there's an inspection, etc. So the AD banks are basically supposed to either, after giving them about 6 reminders, they are supposed to basically strike them off the list and not allow them to lend through the ECB route further. Another minimal change that has come about is basically the hedging requirements for infrastructure space companies, which was earlier at 100%, has been reduced and relaxed to 70%. And lastly, Indian banks and financial institutions are not allowed to give guarantees to resident entities which are borrowing under the ECB. I'll let Neela introduce the next topic and the next speaker.
Thanks, Amrita. That was very informative. So to add a couple of practical benefits or implications of this new regime. One way in which I think that it will really help sort of the startup venture capital ecosystem is in the space of bridge loans, right? So a bridge loan is typically a loan that a startup company may need to tide it over between one fundraise and the other, right? So the extant practice of bridge funding is fairly complicated, right? Because the investors see it as just a method by which they're putting some money into the company, where hopefully that loan will convert at a discount to the next round of funding, so on and so forth. So because the rules relating to equity investment are quite bright line. Even though the idea was for the bridge loan to be a kind of loan, in fact, it would need to be structured as equity in compliance with the equity rule, leading to all kinds of complicated scenarios. So I'm eager to see how venture capital investors use this new ECB framework to structure bridge loans, right? Especially if they are already holding equity in the company, then the restriction that these ECBs cannot be used for working capital or general corporate purposes will not be there. Because otherwise it sounds like you can only use this for some kind of project funding if the lender is not already an equity holder. So I'm quite keen to see what structures emerge in the bridge funding space as VC investors get comfortable with this regime. The other interesting point to see will be on the conversion of the ECB to equity, if an investor ever wants to do that, right? So, because again, typically your VC investors may want to convert the loan into some kind of preferred instrument, right? Whereas, is a conversion to a preferred instrument the best thing, or is it only an equity conversion that can happen? Because the rules are silent on this, right? It just says it can be converted into equity. So therefore the relevant definitions, etc., become important. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for using this in a way that will really benefit the borrower companies. So thank you, Samyukta, for that. The next substantive rules that we want to talk about are again something that have been at the forefront of a lot of controversy in the last few weeks. It has also been on the front pages of newspapers, as we find very high profile e-commerce companies grappling with the implications of these rules for their structures. So my colleague Vishnu is now going to talk about the changes in the e-commerce space.
Thanks, Neela. And yeah, as she said, I think this has been one of the most significant changes that we've seen in the last year, and that we have seen a lot of clients spending sleepless nights because of this. So, I mean, let's dive right in. So over here, I think the first thing we need to talk about is that they've sort of introduced new rules to ensure that, these e-commerce companies comply with the spirit of the restrictions that were already there, such as the no FDI in the inventory-based model, and also sort of ensuring that these marketplaces continue to sort of operate as marketplaces, rather than, control the way sellers on the platform sort of function. So I think that is broadly the reason for some of these changes. Now, coming to the first major point is, the concept of, so the concept over ownership of inventory was always there, and e-commerce, there was no e-commerce, inventory-based e-commerce where FDI was not permitted. But what companies did to sort of get around this and also have more control over the value chain or the supply chain was basically to have a couple of closely related entities which would basically supply the sellers on their platform, and they could always ensure that, a certain kind of product on their platform was always available. Basically ensure that, they had some ability to decide, make sure that the goods were available for sale on the platform. So now what they've done is they've introduced the concept of control over inventory as well. So that means that if a seller on their platform, the person immediately selling on the platform, procures more than 25% of their inventory from the marketplace entity itself or one of their group companies, that would be deemed to be the entity, an e-commerce entity exercising control over the seller, and which would go against the spirit of the ban on inventory-based e-commerce. So that is the first thing we need to talk about. Now, the second thing, again, it goes back to, making sure that these marketplaces continue to function as true marketplaces. So again, here earlier there was a restriction on one seller on the platform. The revenue from the sales of that one seller should not exceed more than 25% of the revenue of the platform in a year. So now that has sort of been replaced with a restriction on any seller with equity participation from the entity cannot sell its products on the platform. So this is a slight change in the construct of the way this is going to work. So yeah, so here we have some, requires some clarity is what is equity participation. These terms are not defined, and we need to see, what kind of situations or shareholding structures they're trying to cover over here. One would presume that any sort of ownership of capital instruments as defined under FEMA is what they're looking at, including, convertible instruments. But we need to see, wait for more clarity on this. And just going back a little bit on, the aspect of control. Over here, one issue that we've seen that is quite debated is how do you also keep track of when that restriction of purchasing more than 25%. How do you keep track of that as an e-commerce entity? So that becomes important because they have to also report compliance with these guidelines to the RBI. Now, see, the way a lot of these companies are structured currently, you can argue that they should be able to easily identify when this threshold is crossed. But what about those sellers who are not closely held entities, but still, for genuine business reasons, they procure more than 25%? Those guys are going to be affected by this. And moreover, the e-commerce marketplace may not be able to monitor their purchasing of inventory, in which case it becomes difficult for them to certify that they're, complying with these guidelines. So those are practical issues around team control and, equity restrictions on the sellers. The next thing is coming to, fair and non-discriminatory dealing. So e-commerce entities are, as you know, are permitted to provide a lot of logistics services to their sellers, which is quite common. And over here, they're saying that, they should be fair and non-discriminatory. Now, there is some debate about, the vagueness of these terms and, what would be permitted and what is not permitted, because there may be genuine business cases for having special terms with one particular seller. Now, they have provided some guidance by saying that, anything which is not provided to a similar seller in similar circumstances wouldn't be fair and would be discriminatory. But again, it doesn't account for, genuine business reasons for having a deviation from the standard mode in which they're providing services. So this is something that, requires some clarity, and there should be some flexibility provided to the e-commerce players on this. Now, coming to the next part is, exclusivity. They've introduced, restricted e-commerce marketplaces from mandating their sellers to just sell on their platform. So again, over here, the concern is there may be, genuine business reasons for having such an exclusivity arrangement. If these players are able to prove that it's, a necessity from a business perspective to do this, is it still a situation that is prohibited by these guidelines? Or what if the seller, for their own business reasons, doesn't want to list or sell their products on a different platform? Is that allowed? How would you sort of justify such an arrangement to the RBI? All of those things sort of need to be looked at, and more clarity on these points, I think, would be appreciated by all the parties involved. And the last aspect on this is, I think, as I mentioned earlier, they have to self-certify compliance with these restrictions by September 30th of every year, which can become tricky in some cases, like the one I mentioned, how will you ensure that sellers are not procuring more than 25% of their inventory from your group companies, if in fact they are independent sellers and not very closely held? So I think that is something that we need some clarity on. So the next, I think that's it as far as the snapshot of the e-commerce press note goes. And I'll hand it over to Neela again to sort of introduce the next speaker.
Thanks, Vishnu. I think that was a interesting insight into something that arouses a lot of heated emotions in various stakeholder lobbies in the country. I understand that the brick and mortar retailers are very happy with these new rules that have come out, whereas the big players, you name them, e-commerce marketplaces, are not happy at all. And in fact, there are also news reports where the US government has made statements wanting to make regulation in the e-commerce space a bilateral issue between India and the US. So understandably so, because some of these e-commerce giants have invested sort of in 6-digit crores of money in this space, and it does give rise to some amount of concern. So let's wait and see what further developments take place in this space. So coming to the next item for discussion on our agenda this evening, we're going to be talking about the new cross-border merger regulations of 2018. It is a bit of a truism and a cliche to say that we live in a globalized world, but that is the reality. And given that MNCs, conglomerates of companies, inevitably do require to set up some kind of presence in jurisdictions where they may be doing business, having customers, etc. The incidence of some of these companies either losing relevance or for tax reasons requiring to be consolidated, or companies needing to be hived off, or if there is an exit from a certain business vertical. There are multiple business cases wherein a certain company being present in a certain jurisdiction may not be relevant anymore for any conglomerate, right? So, so this is a new option that's available to for conglomerates to structure their entities, as well as for various exit options as well. My colleague Darren will now talk a little bit more in detail about these regulations.
So there are two main statutes we're looking at when it comes to these cross-border merger regulations. One is the Companies Act 2013, where Section 234 was notified in the year 2017. Now, Section 234 says that in case of a cross-border merger between an Indian and a foreign company, you'd require prior RBI approval. What these regulations have done is structured the mechanism through which a merger can take place, and any mergers that are undertaken in compliance with these regulations will not require these entities to go to the RBI and seek approval. All that they require to do is comply with each of these regulations as provided under the cross-border merger regulations. So the basic idea behind these regulations is that all of your requirements under FEMA must be complied with. So if you were to go to the next slide, if you have an inbound merger. Now, the difference between an inbound merger and an outbound merger is that in an inbound merger, your resultant entity is going to be based in India. It's going to be the Indian company that absorbs the foreign entity, and an outbound merger is going to have the foreign entity absorb the Indian company. So when you have an inbound merger, you'd be required to comply with FEMA 20. That is when your Indian entity is going to be issuing shares to any foreign shareholders and members of that foreign entity. They'd have to comply with your typical FEMA 20 regulations, such as your pricing guidelines, ensuring that the shares that are issued outside India are at or above fair market value. You'd have to comply with the sectoral caps as present under FEMA 20. And in the specific case where your foreign entity is a joint venture, that is, there is some Indian shareholding in that foreign entity, then you'd also be required to comply with your ODI regulations. So those are the two cases that are mentioned in slide number 15, where your transfer of foreign company is a joint venture, or when your merger results in an acquisition of a step-down subsidiary. Now, in case of an outbound merger, you'd have to comply with your ODI regulations. So, again, when you moving on to how each step of the merger would take place. So, if you were to have any offices in India where you have an inbound, where you have a transfer of foreign entity having particular offices in India, now these entities will be considered as branch offices, and there are separate RBI regulations governing branch offices. So all of these regulations will also have to be complied with by both of these entities. Furthermore, any offices of your Indian entity will also be considered as a branch office in India of your resultant foreign company, and you'll have to comply with your relevant FEMA regulations. The similar concept applies even in case of guarantees. Now, the fundamental idea behind these merger regulations is that you have a 2-year relaxation period where, in case, for example, you are holding assets you're not permitted to hold in consonance with FEMA, you have 2 years to dispose of these assets and remit all of your proceeds and your sale assets in that time period. Now, you can use these proceeds in order to clear any debts of your Indian entity or your foreign entity. But after 2 years, you will no longer be entitled to hold these assets, and you will have to comply with all of your FEMA regulations. So for procedural purposes, they've also incorporated provisions relating to how you open your bank account and the types of bank accounts that can be held depending on whether it's an inbound or an outbound merger. So again, the time period that's specified under these regulations is 2 years from the date of sanction by the NCLT. So once the merger process is complete and the scheme of merger is sanctioned by your National Company Law Tribunal, you will have a 2-year period in which you can comply, in which you have some amount of grace time to sell any assets that are not held in compliance with FEMA, and subsequent to that, you will have to comply with all of your FEMA regulations. So finally, the additional conditions that have been specified under these merger regulations is that your valuation will have to be in compliance with Rule 25A of the Company Rules 2017, which basically says that your valuation has to be in accordance with internationally accepted principles of accounting and valuation. And any compensation that the resultant company wants to pay to a holder of your of a security of the Indian company should be in accordance with your NCLT scheme. Now, in case your shareholder in the Indian company is acquiring equity in the foreign entity, what's important to note is that the limits to which you can hold shares in your foreign entity have to be in accordance with the liberalized remittance scheme. That is, you can hold up to 250,000 USD in accordance with LRS. Now, also, you would have to comply with all of your typical reporting requirements that you have under the RBI. So the basic idea behind these merger regulations is that you do not have to come to the RBI specifically for approval, provided that each and every step of your both sides of the merging entities comply with their relevant FEMA regulations. And that summarizes what these merger regulations are about. So I'll just leave it to Neela to conclude on these points, and anyone who has any questions can let either me, Samyukta, or Vishnu know.
Thanks, Arvind. So I think we now have time for some Q&A. And I think that for everyone who's joined on Zoom, there is a chat window in which you can ask your questions. So Vishnu, there's a form on questions if you want to take that. You can answer it live.
Okay, so the first question is, if you're filing Form DI, how much late fee can be levied if Form DI is filed after a period of 30 days? So I think under the existing regime, so we don't have the late filing fee, I think, is quite minimal. I can get back to you with the exact number. But earlier, I think you had a long drawn out compounding procedure, which we had to follow under FEMA. But now, again, because the RBI has recognized that all of these filings are, typically there have been delays which are sort of not the company's fault. They're a little more relaxed now, and it's just a minimal late filing fee. I'll just let you know in this chat window right here what the exact figure is.
Okay, you can come back to that.
Yeah.
Are there
Any other questions?
If you guys have any questions, you're most welcome to ask the in-person attendees as well. Do you have any questions?
Actually, you know the EC guidelines. I was just, all the project finance which was happening, now we have all these 100 cities. So the filing is as per the new filing forms, and do they have separate? And how do you work?
Shamika, you want to just sit here and summarize the question and whatever, if you have any input.
This is something that I'll have to check. There have been changes. Like I said, the form for application and filing of the returns has been consolidated.
Yeah, that's why I was asking, because earlier we had different NDUs and there were different forms, especially for infrastructure projects or projects that were separate detailed filing.
Yeah.
And even now it is the same LRM which is applicable.
Yeah.
But it's a single one across.
It's a single form for all tracks.
No, LRM is also single for it runs for each separate.
If I'm not wrong, it runs separately for each.
So that
doesn't change.
And even you were mentioning with respect to filing of forms, there is an issue with respect to multiple transactions or other multiple purchasers and filing. So how does the timeline run there?
So, for example, currently we're working on a matter where there are a handful of sellers of shares, right? So, FCTRS, of course, now with the new name, has to be filed for each one of them.
Yeah.
So, it has to run in sequence. So, you finish uploading with respect to one buyer and seller. Once you get the acknowledgement, or once you've successfully uploaded that, then you can start uploading the next one.
Because if you want to wait for the authorization or acceptance, that may then have a huge line of buyers and sellers, and that may just run past the 30-day period.
Yeah. In fact, this, it's a big problem where companies were earlier not compliant at all.
Yeah.
Their hard copy forms only they've not filed. So now when they've had to make the transition to the new system, there is so much of chaos and confusion between their actual cap table. What is it that they have filed? And then now what is it that the system will allow them to upload, because it has to tally with your entity master form.
The other thing I want to ask is are the supporting documents required for FCGPL or FCPL? They still remain the same in terms of all those consents, and so there is provision enough
Same
to
thing.
upload those.
Absolutely. I think,
Quite,
yeah, but one thing which I really like about this is that they have come out with this nice instruction manual
okay.
about how you can fill each entry, right? What are the ways in which you can fill it? So that I find is quite useful actually, because I remember even this in sequence filing is helpful in one way, right? Because we've seen cases where again, if you had like multiple things happening at the same time, like say if you had a primary investment and a secondary investment happening simultaneously, right? So at one moment your cap table is not frozen, in the sense,
how is it going to impact the changes in the cap table in a single transaction?
yeah. So because it'll have to be done sequentially, it's simpler to my mind, right? Because earlier, when you had to do these hard copy filings, when you had primaries and secondaries happening at the same time, you'd have to put a note saying, listen, I'm indicating the percentage shareholding on a fully diluted basis as this, because there is also a secondary happening, because there is also a primary happening at the same time. So please take that into account. Please look at all these forms as a whole, but like now it'll actually happen as a build up, right? One after the other. So it kind of becomes a little more mathematically easier to compute in that sense,
It doesn't have as much of teething problem as NCA had when they went online with all the file.
I think there are a lot of problems, but
Because even now NCA forms when you download view, after then your computer keeps crashing. Because the forms, I mean, you really need to upgrade your computer to, you have multiple forms opening the digital signature. It's quite cumbersome to open and read. So when we are doing diligence, it's quite a task to.
absolutely.
So I'm wondering how this is going to pan out in terms of challenges with respect to your IT system.
That's a point, and I think that we've also seen some really very small and silly things also happening. I don't know. Do you remember that issue, Vishnu, where there was that totaling, the mathematical error? You remember what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, decimal points.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it round off?
That is the big.
Yeah, so essentially the issue we've seen is that you have to round off properly to do two decimal points, and the consideration into the number of shares when you that should perfectly match the total consideration you receive. And if it's 3 decimal points and there's some minor errors with that, it leads to a lot of problems. So there, I think when we were very particular about determining setting the sale price per share. When you're doing that, you have to be quite careful, and we've seen clients.
So even with that, the problem also will be on the conversion. The FX rate for conversion will impact your
Correct.
actual consideration.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can go into decimals, which then become.
Yeah, it's that excess money coming in because of exchange rate fluctuations is a common issue that we see.
So how is that being addressed? Because this at some point doesn't understand. The system will not understand those kind of minor glitches. It's more a glitch. I don't know how.
See, precisely to solve for this, what we always recommend and suggest is that make sure that your two decimal places, right, that multiplied by the number of shares that you're getting should exactly equal to your investment amount. That's a better way to deal with it, because then otherwise you'll not have all these things. But otherwise, it's a pain. It's definitely a pain.
The requirements in this is the same.
Yeah, that's the same. There's no change on that front. The banks have to take care of that.
And one more question on ECB. The foreign equity holder could be a corporate. Then they are treated on par with individuals in terms of being a foreign equity holder and what you will receive money that's being spent by a foreign.
Yes, that's
so there is.
Yeah, there is. Okay, do we have any other questions? I don't think so, right? She is, but I think it was just because my cursor was hovering. Not anything. Okay. So thank you everyone for attending this webinar. We hope you found it useful, and we'd be happy to answer any further questions that you have. Do get in touch with us. Thank you.
Our major issues of taking